Jan, welcome to this Maersk Trade Talk. Really happy to have you here.
Happy to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Maybe we just kick off with you explaining a bit of what you do at UNCTAD. You've been at UNCTAD a couple of decades. What's your role? What do you do? What's your perspective on the maritime trade?
Yeah, at UNCTAD we like to say we think, debate and deliver, and it's all paid for by your taxes. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So our terms of reference are to help developing countries trade better. So we do research, produce public goods like our review of maritime transport, country profiles, so on. Then we debate, we provide a forum for member countries. Our member countries are also the member countries of the WTO, World Trade Organization. They are also the member countries of the IMO, International Maritime Organization. So by helping them learn, understand, negotiate, we help them also prepare for negotiations, for example, in other fora or in Antarctica. Then the third part, the deliver, is a lot of technical assistance, really going into a port and training, helping reforming, build up smart ports, concession contracts. Other groups have customs automation programs, a lot of practical technical assistance. So all in all, in this thinking here together, the first part, this research, I see as a bit like interpreters or translators. So we try to learn, we participate in academic fora, private sector fora, and then we transmit this to our clients, the negotiator, the ambassador in Geneva, the ministry, the port authority, maritime authority in the countries.
I like this image of translators, interpreters, of trying to understand what's going on. And certainly over the last couple of years, we've seen an extraordinary set of developments in particularly container trade and end-to-end logistics. You've been watching trade for, as you said, quite some decades. What have we learned? What have you learned from observing this most recent period?
Yeah, I mean, this huge surge in freight rates, the whole congestion situation, the whole supply chain crisis. In other shipping segments, we had seen similar situations before. We had seen the $300,000 per day for a dry bulk carrier 2007, 2008. We had seen not so long ago that oil tankers all of a sudden became very valuable. You all saying $300,000 per day when the oil price went negative. Nobody wanted oil. What do I do with it? I need an oil tanker to store it. And if you need 20 containers or container ships or oil tankers or dry bulk tankers, and there are only 19, the elasticity of demand, and we are both economists, means the price goes through the roof. I pay whatever it takes. Now, the most recent supply chain crisis about the containerized trade, which is about 2/3 of value of shipping. No, it's in containers. So I really want this smartphone for Christmas. I really need this screw as a spare part. I really need this component to build my globalized production. So I pay whatever it takes. And we say that's then a very steep demand curve. And if then the supply moves to the left, the steep supply curve, because ships spend 20% more in port, because the containers are in the wrong place, because the crisis caught us in the wrong moment when the order book was very low, there were no new ships coming. It was crazy. They went through the roof. And another lesson learned then from this particular one, we are quite proud that now a bit more than a year ago, we simulated the impact on inflation, on consumer prices. So a year, September, October, we did that simulation. We did not yet see inflation. And there were policymakers, academics, columnists of the New York Times writing, don't worry. He said, well, at least these high freight rates in container shipping in our simulation will lead to 1.5% additional consumer prices. He said, no, come on, it's only that little in the... But 6 months later, the IMF, and I think you used to work there, so I think they are trustworthy, they measured, they measured what really caused the then surging inflation. They said, 1.5 percentage points was due to higher freight rates. So we were really spot on. Yeah. And of course, there are different products. And it is true that for many products, you say, no, it is still, whether the freight rate is 2,000 or 15,000, But I found interesting, two types of products are particularly impacted. One type of product are very cheap, like low value, high volume. Think of plastic garden chairs, a container full of white plastic. If there the freight rate goes up from 2,000 to 15,000, it starts making a difference. And you then no longer buy them in Europe, made in Asia or elsewhere, and you start making them in Southern Eastern Europe instead. And the other one that I found even more interesting, some very high value products. You say, but it's still only a small part of the value of the good. Yes, but during the production process of that high value optical, medical equipment, cars, the inputs, the unfinished products, the bits and pieces are moved several times, very so-called deep supply chains. So there, for some of these products, our simulation said 10, 11, 12% additional percentage points, additional consumer prices on these products. But I think lessons learned, first of all, it matters, and a little shortage of supply can lead to a high increase. And I think we'll come back to this later when we discuss with the future and decarbonization and energy transition. And, well, it actually does matter for prices. So, we were quite a lot in the press with our simulation, with our annual report, with this Bloomberg, Financial Times, Reuters, and all that. Wow. And was one of the lessons learned.
In the dialogue you and we've had with policymakers, there's also been a lot of learnings there from their side. How have you seen that? How have you seen their sort of insights in supply chain evolve and their thinking around the policies around supply chains and resilience evolve?
Yeah, especially during these last couple of years. Unfortunately, there was a lot of blame game. Of course, I understand that shippers, stakeholders, policymakers are not happy. Carriers did make high profits and the freight rates went up and waiting times, schedule reliability went down. So we really try to contribute to the understanding what are the long-term underlying causes and trends, what explains differences in freight rates. We come up with some suggestions about trade efficiency in ports, about regulation. There's a lot of discussion what antitrust immunity should be given to alliances or not. So we really try to be neutral and look at the facts and like this, help policymakers, regulators, stakeholders, come to amicable, constructive, positive solutions. Yeah. And in this particular reason, we can call it supply chain crisis. I think one of the lessons learned, still continuing the previous question, the need for a stable, predictable environment, regulatorily legal environment. Private sector and public sector need to invest early in time, and to do this, you need to know what will be the future price of carbon, what will be the future regulation and the future energy source, and they all need to move together. The carriers, the energy generators, the energy providers, the ports, the distributors. And there, I think speaking to our stakeholders, partners, member states who then negotiate at the IMO, at UNCTAD, at WTO, I think that's one of the things, rather than having blame games about this moment and why do you make more money than I. No. Let's think about lessons learned. Let's think about the real challenge ahead, the energy transition, the decarbonization, and make sure we get this right. We don't have this type of situation again.
Yeah. We'll come back to this energy and transition in a moment. But you mentioned the word trends. And as we are coming to the end of 2022 and we looked at 2023, there's obviously a lot of focus on what's coming next, what's coming at us over the next 12 months and beyond. What lays ahead? What are you focused on in terms of the trends ahead in the maritime space?
Yeah, it's really interesting. We have all these data sets which we have since the 1960s, and you have these long-term trends like the average distance traveled per ton of cargo over the decades has gone up. Like iron ore from Brazil goes more to China and less to Europe. LNG from Trinidad goes more to Japan and less to the US. Longer distances. The last year, 21 compared to 20, that's where we have the data, for the first time in many years, actually this went slightly down. The share of expenditure on inventory holding vis-à-vis expenditure on transport, the long term, the share of inventory holding went down. More efficiency, more just in time, better trade facilitation. Last year, it went slightly up. The share of developing countries' imports, including China, for decades has increased. Last year, it slightly decreased. So this is data, this hard data, and we look and say, now, does this now mean a change in long-term trend? Or is this just a hiccup during the crisis, including the war in Ukraine, including lockdowns, including the supply chain crisis? Or will we go back, and we will then go back to the long-term trend? So I don't know to answer your question, but this is a type of thing we are monitoring, and it's beautiful that nowadays with all the AIS data on ships, like I know where every ship is right now, how fast it's going from where to where. So you have a lot of interesting data also for trade, the geography of trade, from this type of data. But another specific thing, as you asked, like looking ahead. And as you say, this particular thing of the ship sizes and consolidation and shipping, concentration process, I've looked at this since 1996 when I was working at the IMO and then ECLA. We have never had such a long period that the maximum ship size has not increased further as we have now. It's now since shortly before COVID, we have 24,000 TEU, and they have not gone up. And now the biggest ships, container ships, are roughly as big as the biggest oil tankers and biggest dry bulk. No? So question is, will we now finally, after having said for decades, this is now the biggest, it will not, now, maybe now we have reached the biggest. Now this one you know better than me. You know what you are ordering. I think there are on the order book up to 28,000 TEU, not order books, on the drawing boards. But I do think that we will reach or have reached the limit. And this has also implication on the further process of consolidation and the likelihood that the dear carriers will resume undercutting each other. Because as long as ship sizes went up, those who could afford it, they bought the biggest ship. You generated economies of scale. You could offer the cost, you produced your service at a lower cost per container. But what did you do with the old ship? You returned it to the owner, or you sold it if it was yours. So were not scrapped. And this led for decades to an oversupply, which you know better, which led for decades to very low rates of return. So now we have at the same time, coincidentally, unfortunately for anybody who wants to study causes in history, a natural experiment, we have at the same time the COVID crisis, supply chain crisis, and probably a plateau in the ship size. So if from now on the carriers stop undercutting each other, we don't know whether it is because of some change in the geography of trade and the supply chain, or because we have finally stopped this huge long-term shipping cycle.
Mm-hmm. So does that speak then to an expectation that perhaps you see an environment where, a changing environment where we've seen this almost several decades long reduction in freight rates as efficiency has been realized, to maybe a plateauing, to maybe even a potential increase, especially when you consider the additional costs of the energy transition and all of the other uncertainties that supply chains are having to deal with? Is that a scenario together with a lot of volatility?
I think that over the decades we have seen a change in the type of cost, in the variable vis-a-vis the fixed costs in producing a shipping service. If you have a smaller, older ship, you have higher variable costs to produce the service. You have to pay your seafarers, your fuel, your communication. If you have a modern, bigger ship, the variable costs are lower. Like instead of an expensive phone call, you have almost no cost fixed. You have a flat rate for your communication, and so on and so forth. Fuel efficiency. But the fixed costs are much higher. So if you translate this in a supply curve, in a production function, it means when there's enough supply, there's a lot of competition, a lot of owners offer their container ship. And I still remember this from good old times when my family had a little shipping business, so Captain Hoffmann. He had to pay his seafarers, he had to pay the bank, he had to pay his fuel, communication. But as long as he would pay this, he would charter his tween-decker at a very low price. Then at times there was a lot of demand, not enough ships, then it went up a lot. So this supply curve has become steeper due to this change, variable cost via fixed cost. And a steeper supply curve also means that if there's a shift in demand, it becomes more volatile. So I like to explain it with curves moving from the left and the right, but I hope intuitively this is, if we just imagine there's a ship owner who doesn't want to lose money, obviously, so as long as he can pay the variable cost, it's fine. But at some point in time, he has to pay back his bank. So at some point in time, the average has to go up, and then they go up even further.
Yeah.
So it's more, and we see the data. The freight rates, the container charter rates over the decades have become more volatile. And I think this is one of the reasons. This change in the variable fixed cost relationship.
Yeah. No, it's a very good insight, and I think if you're a customer or a buyer of those services, it's something you need to be very much aware of when you think about how you want to play in a spot market or a contract market to try and hedge or play out some of that volatility. Just keeping that framework in, and if we think about, we touched on it earlier about sustainability and then the transition to green fuels, how do you see that playing into that analysis you just presented with the cost curves and so on? How does that likely play out in that framework?
Yeah, we really see a danger there, and we highlighted this when we launched our review of maritime transport. Our Secretary General put this in her key lessons learned points. This uncertainty about the future regulation, future fuels, future price of CO2 makes investors wait. I mean, it's obvious. It's difficult to measure what would be the investment in new ships, new ports, new hinterland, if we knew we could use the same fuel for many more decades. And we had the same, but there's a lot of anecdotal evidence. We speak at conferences, stakeholders in policy. A lot of evidence that investors are waiting. And what does waiting mean? It means, again, my mindset, the supply curve moves to the left. It means if there is no demand coming back, and we are talking here about many more, up to 2050, we are really talking about the decades to come. So there will be ups and downs in economic development and demand and surges, but if we are all waiting too much and too long. So I think one of the lessons learned here is we really need a predictable, ideally multilateral framework that all stakeholders invest, and we avoid a repetition of this, what we saw recently. There was not enough supply and freight rates went through the roof.
Yeah. Immediately ahead of us, we have some legislation coming in through IMO in 2023. Can you speak to that a little bit about what that aims to do and what the impact could be on the shipping environment?
It's very important, and we work really closely, positively with the IMO. We have, I believe, sincerely helped the IMO process by doing an impact assessment of the short-term measures. So before the IMO members were willing to agree on these short-term measures, they wanted to know what is the economic impact on maritime logistics costs, impact on trade, impact on GDP. And we did this for every ship in the world, every journey of every ship in the world. Then we aggregated this into 11 industry segments, every pair of country, and concluded order of magnitude, like how much maritime logistics costs will go up, like plus 2%, depending on which scenario, which leads to a decrease in trade by 0.2% order of magnitude, which leads to a decrease of GDP by 0.02%. So it's just not the exact numbers, it's all in our reports, but to get the order of magnitude. And I found this fascinating. Overall, it means it's not a lot. If freight rates went up fivefold now, and other rates went up tenfold, and now we're talking about 2%. If you draw it on a line, and we did this for our IMO report, like you put the freight rate volatility, and then you put on top of this, what would 2% increase mean? And people say, I don't see it. Yeah, look, there's a green line, and you hardly don't see it. But it is not nothing. I think this is important. It's not zero. And for us, important, those who are more negatively impacted are the least developed countries and the small island developing states. So this is for us at UNCTAD very important. And in that sense, coming back to what is in the future or what may come out of IMO negotiations, we believe there are a lot of advantages in a price on carbon. Call it the internalization of externalities, call it a levy, call it a contribution, call it an economic measure, market-based measure. But we need to make alternative fuels competitive, and you can only do this by increasing the price of the traditional ones. And the beauty of this measure is it can generate funds. It generates funds that can be invested in the energy transition, and it can help those least developed countries, more vulnerable, more export dependent, the small island states, who are not the culprits of climate change. So they're the ones most negatively affected by climate change. I've been to quite a few islands where you can see the impact. They're most affected. It's not their fault. And now they will also be most affected by climate change mitigation. That's not fair. So that's why I think this measure, as an economist, that's where we have to go. It helps have a predictable, clearer future framework, not to discourage investment. It makes alternative fuels competitive, and it generates funds that can actually be reassigned to help the energy transition and to help the most vulnerable.
Yeah, I think we would wholeheartedly agree. Being the leading edge of investing into renewable fuels and ships in the maritime space, I think this is a key element that would assist that. What are the roadblocks to getting us there? Do you see that being achieved in the next few years? Is it something that is further off? What do you think are the elements preventing it happening?
Let's not cheat ourselves. This leads to higher shipping costs. Yeah, by how much? Is it a lot or not compared to what? But it leads to higher shipping costs, and countries that depend more on shipping exports, that depend on exporting fresh beef and don't want this to be frozen beef because ships have to go slower, or countries that depend on exporting cherries, grapes, avocados, long distance, or low value goods, iron ore, long distance. I mean, they are worried, and we have to be realistic there. They are rightly worried. Now, what I honestly think is that by delaying the decisions, by maintaining the uncertainty, the real impact on freight rates is worse. Like delaying the decision makes it more expensive. Delaying the decision will just lead to a need to do more even later. And during the process, this uncertainty leads to not enough investment, shift of the supply curve to the left, and even more increase of freight rates. So those countries who depend on lower freight costs are understandably worried. But I sincerely believe it is also in these countries' interest to agree on whatever, as long as we have the stability. That is one stumbling block, a sincere, valid interest. The other one is the politics, the legislation, there's the oil pollution compensation fund. There are some examples where you have funds, but we are talking about a lot of money here. What name do we give it? There are certainly member countries of the UN, of the IMO, who are very reluctant to have anything that smells like a tax globally. So I think that's another stumbling block. It's how do you formulate it? Who will collect it? Where will it be stored? Who decides what to do with it? How do we call it? It's not a pretext. It's a real challenge, more for the lawyers and policymakers, and then different governments may change political parties in key countries. So I think that's another real stumbling block.
It's very insightful, and we certainly value all of the efforts that you're putting in to kind of make those arguments and get the right discussions in the right places. We focus quite a bit now on sort of the supply side and the supply curve. Can we switch a bit to the demand curve, because it's the intersection of the two that kind of gives the picture of the market. And it happened before COVID, but a lot of talk about shifting trade patterns have accelerated during COVID and after COVID, and you gave some statistics earlier which sort of maybe hints at some of that. How are you thinking about that? What are you seeing in terms of those shifts? What's driving those potential shifts in trade patterns from what you're seeing and hearing?
There has been all this talk about nearshoring, friendshoring, near sourcing.
You name it. Many labels.
And also this other label, rather than just in time, have just in case. And I don't like either of these. Let's say the just in time, just in case. What is just in time actually? Even if you want to keep a higher stock of inventory holding as a reserve, you still want to be efficient. You still want to keep that level at that level. You don't want to have run it down, and if the crisis catches you when you're at zero, it still didn't help you at all to start with a higher stock. I mean, it doesn't make sense. So you still want to have the most efficient just-in-time delivery. You want the things when you need them. What I find more important is diversification that we do see. And this is from your industry, you produce chips, cameras, cars, whatever. You don't want to depend on only very few suppliers. I myself, I like photography. And I remember there was a point in time where Nikon could no longer produce its cameras because the one factory that produced one component was in Bangkok, and there were floods in Bangkok, and so you better want to diversify. So by the same token, the whole diversification, resilience of trade, demand, I think we see two things. We should see more diversification. Just logically, if there is some elasticity of demand towards the cost of transport, we will see somewhat lower distances. A classic example always given, like United States imports from China compete with United States imports from Mexico. If shipping costs go up, Mexico's share will somewhat increase vis-a-vis the Chinese share. And this we had also in our model when we did the impact assessment for the IMO. What would higher logistics costs mean, higher maritime logistics costs? In our model, we did see like the exports from China to the US would go down a little more than the exports from Mexico to the US. So this is one thing, a bit slightly shorter distances, a bit more diversification, but I do not really see the more less just in time or more warehousing. We don't really see it.
We were talking about the shift from just single source to multi-sourcing, right? And what's the other side of that now? If you're looking for logistics providers to support you, do you then require a different model and sort of...
And like also what I think we will probably see is to be more careful about like too deep supply chains. Now with more risks, higher costs, more uncertainty to build resilience, you don't really want to have a situation. We had one Asian car maker had to recall cars, and they found out the component of the component of the component that didn't work was like the 9th level in the supply chain. So they can no longer control this. And now with higher volatility, higher freight costs, the need for more resilience, if all these 9 steps have to be shipped, you may not want this. You may want to have, I don't know, only 5 or 6, I don't know. So the deep supply chains, they are part of this beautiful globalized efficiency and globalized world, and it's a lot of positive things there that we all benefit from. But apart from the diversification, I see also probably there's a good reasons not to try to have too deep supply chains.
This, I think you raised this, you had this phrase in your report called resilience by design. Is that what you're speaking to here? That rather than try to impose a resilient framework on top of a flawed design system, you actually try and redesign it.
And all this takes time. It takes, also what we saw now with the supply chain crisis there, where people who said, we might have had it in any case in a few years because investment wasn't catching up, especially in the United States ports, the whole intermodal system, the port system, the working arrangements. And so we had this surge in demand with the stimulus packages, but that same increase in demand might have come in any case 2, 3, 4 years later, and we might also have had this congestion. But I don't know, it's a bit hypothetical, but all this to the need to plan in time and foresee this type of demand. And again, we come back to the need for a predictable framework. Otherwise, I delay my investments.
Yeah. This predictability, visibility also speaks to technology in supply chains. And this is the silver bullet that many are looking to realize dreams that have been there for many years, decades, if you speak to logisticians. So they've always thought about these visible, real-time supply chains where they can monitor and divert and adjust. Is this the moment? Is technology now where we need it to be to facilitate those seamless end-to-end, visible, actionable supply chains?
We have seen a lot of progress during the last 2-3 years in programs that we have been promoting and worked on it at UNCTAD for decades. We have been promoting single windows, advanced ruling, customs automation, smart ports, pre-arrival processing, e-payments, electronic signatures, and many stakeholders were a bit reluctant. Public, private sector, brokers, agents said, no, I prefer this to be inefficient because then the client needs me even more. So it's difficult to quantify, but I would say we have like 3 times more demand and interest in this over the last couple of years than the previous comparable periods. And now I like to say we have to lock in the progress made during lockdown. So I hope we won't go back to bad old practices, but we have seen progress in this. And, there have been e-bill of lading initiatives, and I've asked people working on this, and they also have worked on this for 10 years, 20 years, and said, would this also have happened without COVID? And André Simmer from MSC told me, no, it would not have happened without COVID.
Yeah. No, it's accelerated a lot of things. I mean, yet despite the technology being there are key elements that still need to come together, such as data sharing. I mean, our recent experience with TradeLens that we discussed earlier, I think is a very good example of that. So I think there's an industry maturity element that's needed as well to realize.
In fact, I mean, the TradeLens, I confess I was surprised. I might even say I was disappointed that this didn't work out. We had the very early stages when it was not even called TradeLens. We had a colleague from TradeLens in our UNCTAD offices. He gave a briefing, and it was really interesting discussion. We connected with our customs automation system, with Asikuda. So I would have hoped that this crisis would have motivated even more to get it over the threshold. But apparently didn't. But then you cannot ask me. I have to ask you. What happened? Why did it not work out?
I think it comes back to this data sharing issue, and I think that there are other industries that are very competitive where this works. I think it's a journey, right? It's a maturity that needs to be reached before you get to that realization of the win-win of sharing data. So technology is clearly there, as Tradeland was showing. It's just that sort of commercialization of it and that business model around it. Yeah, this has been a fantastic conversation, fascinating, insightful as ever. I like to end up on sort of 3 points, if you will. And as we're approaching Christmas, perhaps 3 wishes on your list for next year. What would they be if you could make that list?
Okay, dreaming is free of charge. I think the first one we had discussed, it came up several times, this necessity to have a price on carbon, to have an economic measure, a market-based measure, to make alternative fuels competitive, and at the same time generate funds that can be used and invested, and have a stable, multilateral, preferably, not different regions, framework. So here I'm not criticizing the IMO, but on the contrary, we are really sincerely very supportive of the efforts made by IMO delegates, by IMO Secretariat. But I think the more we look at it and what is happening, we have seen a shift in mindset. So my wish list for Christmas would be, let us hopefully advance with these economic measures in shipping. The second one is the fear of not investing enough in time, which is linked to the uncertainty. If we don't have certainty, there's not enough investment. And we got some criticism on social media, comments. When in our latest review of maritime transport, we said we need more investments. And then people said, well, look at the order book and look how freight rates are going down. And look at the poor carriers who will lose money in 2 or 3 years because there will be too big ships. These are 2 different things. There is the whole peak cycle situation, the shipping cycles, the volatility, and yes, things happened as in the past. Ships were bought when there was money and ordered, and they take 2, 3, 4 years to be delivered. But we are really thinking about the much longer term issue of the investment in the energy transition. That requires this predictable framework and it requires investments on a far bigger scale. So I wanted to clarify this, that I'm not saying that there will not be enough ships in 2 years, but we will not have the right ships and enough infrastructure ships in 10 years from now if we don't get it right. And the third wish for Santa Claus is the technology. I think I said earlier, or maybe I didn't, but technological progress will never be as slow as today. Of course, it's not slow, it's fast, but it's going to be even faster. And one lesson learned from another set of negotiations that took place in Geneva was at the WTO, the World Trade Organization, negotiations on the Trade Facilitation Agreement, which started in 2004, concluded in 2013. At the beginning of the negotiations, there were proposals that said every country and every customs authority must publish the duties and rules and forms to fill out on the internet. Nowadays we say that, of course, obvious. But at that time, 2004, 2005, there were least developed countries that said, I don't have the technology. It's too expensive. I cannot invest, and so on. And these were sincere, valid concerns. But already at that time, UNCTAD, as advisor to the negotiator, said, technology will advance. Don't set the rules now on today's technology, but think of the future technologies. Negotiations are slower than technological progress. Yeah. So John Kerry was criticized for saying that the technologies we need to decarbonize, not just shipping, but generally, they don't yet exist. And Greta, for whom I have a lot of respect, sincerely, she criticized him, she ridiculed him for this, and I disagree with her. I agree with John Kerry. We cannot plan for future needs of the energy transition thinking only of today's existing technologies. And there's so much progress being made, so many forecasts about the capacities of batteries, about the outreach of electric cars, and so on. We were always too conservative. And again, from my experience with these negotiations at the WTO, negotiations were slower than technological progress. So, dear member states of the IMO, think along those lines, prepare the decarbonization of shipping, thinking about the future technologies, and let us be optimistic. They will come, the solutions.
Thanks, Jan, and that's a great way to end on an optimistic note. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.